René Girard will be remembered as one of the most important social theorists of the 20th century, and to discuss his work, I brought in my two favorite Girard scholars, Johnathan Bi and Luke Burgis. Both of them have had their lives transformed by Girard's observations, but both of them became frustrated with his prescriptions. They liked his analysis of the world, but they didn't exactly resonate with what he thought that we should do about it. And so they have both spent some time completing Girard, asking what should we actually do about his mimetic theory. And they each wrote books to answer that question. Luke Burgis wrote one called Wanting, and Johnathan Bi wrote one called Completing Girard. And this is a conversation about those two books, and we really get into the weeds of René Girard, unlike any conversation I've ever had about his work. So I hope you enjoy it.
I want to start off with the difference between equality and sameness. Luke, this is something that you talk a lot about in your book. And to me, or to almost anybody before they read Girard, I think that they would see these things as synonyms. But Girard points out that equality and sameness are actually different things, and that sameness in particular can have some pretty catastrophic second-order effects. Talk about that.
Yeah, we tend to equate equality with sameness in the modern world, and that can be a very dangerous thing. Equality, the way that I use it in the book, when I say that it is a good thing, I'm talking about fundamental human dignity, human rights, equality of opportunity. Girard says that there's a form of negative undifferentiation that is a positive thing. It's the form of equality in terms of we see that other people are like us, that they're a human being with freedom and with dignity, and we begin to identify with them. So that's the ground of empathy. It's the ground of Christian love. We identify with the other, and that's a positive thing. It becomes negative undifferentiation. It becomes a source of conflict when we equate equality with sameness. And we think that because we're different than the other people, then something must inherently be wrong. So it's almost like we can't look at equality without always sort of running towards sameness and having equality blend into sameness. We can't be equal yet different. But that's the entire sort of ground of modern societies, that we've got to be able, right, to like coexist in that way. In Christian theology, like the Trinity is like the supreme example of this. You know, equality but difference in the three persons of the Trinity. We haven't quite figured that out on a worldly societal level yet.
Yeah, I perhaps I'm a bit more pessimistic in my reading than Luke, and I think equality but different is always brings up Augustus in my mind as a first citizen, first among equals, or the Animal Farm quote of some animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, and so I think it's a really tricky concept. What I definitely do agree with you, Luke, is that Girard at least seems to think that a true and genuine form of compassion is, if not only possible, best exemplified between two equals, and that there is something that is fundamentally good in what the Christian revelation brought about that has led to modernity. However, and this is where maybe perhaps a more pessimistic reading comes in, I think it's quite clear that Girard takes this movement of equality, justice, transparency, rationality as the herald of apocalypse, very violent apocalypse in some sense. And, let me read a quote from Girard's last book, translated to English as Battling to the End. Our world is both the worst it has ever been and the best. It is said that more victims are killed, but we also have to admit that more are saved than ever before. Everything is increasing, some of which are marvelous and others dreadful. And so I think that for Girard, and I think this is what makes his philosophy of history really, really interesting, is that it is fundamentally ambivalent to the core. that the currents which Girard identifies as being spawned from the Christian revelation is both a form of radical goodness, but also it brings about, if not a radical evil, certainly worldly violence, right? And this is in line with that Matthew quote that Girard always likes to say, where Christ says, I do not bring peace, but a sword. And I think perhaps this is what made Girard, or one of the reasons that made Girard so interesting to engage in my philosophical developments, because I studied under some very famous Hegelians in our current age. And what's really interesting about Girard is that I think Girard, very loosely speaking, would mostly agree with almost everything that Hegel says about the descriptive change in history, right? The expansion of rationality, the expansion of equality and rights. But he would take a very ambivalent tone towards that. He would say, yes, Hegel, both what you defined is descriptively is correct. Your normative praise of that is also warranted, but you're not seeing all the evil that this equality brings about. And so yeah. I guess I wouldn't say I have a problem with saying that equality is good, but there's a big asterisk.
Huge asterisk.
At the end.
Somebody, I think it was one of René Girard's friends, called him the most ambivalent of men, right? And that, like, he always sort of saw, the good and the bad and everything. And I think it's Battling to the End, or in one of his books, he said that Christianity is the only religion that has basically sowed the seeds and foretold of its own demise, in a sense.
Yes,
right?
It brought about its own demise.
It brought about its own demise, right? And it forced a choice. And one big question that I have is, I think in my reading, that choice has to happen on an individual level, right? It's not going to happen on a societal level. And in that sense, Girard was very, very pessimistic, right? And sort of said we're ushering in the apocalypse, and few will be saved, kind of, right? Which echoes something that Jesus said. I don't know, man. I mean, maybe one of the only ways to avert the apocalypse is for all computer science students to double major in philosophy. That might be the only, like you did. That might be one way to make.
Perhaps. I think I remember where that quote is from. I think it's in book 2 in Things Hidden, where he says that the Christian revelation brought about its own demise. Specifically, in its own success, it became the last sort of aggressor, right? If the fundamental Christian impetus for Girard is to protect the victim, Christianity, through its own success and its gaining worldly power, became its put that target on its own back. And so, and I love that. I never heard about that before, that Girard was the most ambivalent man, but I totally agree with that. And I think that's what makes him fascinating. That's also what makes people like Tocqueville, I think, really fascinating. Just being able to grapple with ambivalence. And, this also reminds me of a story that people tell about Peter Thiel, where they say when working with Thiel, it's almost like he has a Mexican standoff in his head all the time. And that he is always jumping from position to position.
I think Peter Thiel has the Battle of Lepanto going on in his head at all times. Yeah,
I think that this idea that you spoke about earlier, Jonathan, that things have been the worst that they've ever been and the best that they've ever been, can both be true. This is probably my favorite critique of Steven Pinker's work. That what Pinker gets. Yes, he's right about a lot of his very numerical claims about how the world is getting better in some ways, but what he's missing is this potential energy that exists in the world. He's really talking about the kinetic energy that's happening right now. And so how this applies to Girard is that, Luke, you talk about how the opening lines of Romeo and Juliet are two houses, both alike in dignity, the Montagues and the Capulets. They are the same. That then leads to conflict. And what you have there is a very Girardian idea of conflict, is that two people are fighting over who's going to get the last cup of coffee in the kitchen. And all of a sudden you have the entire town that is just fighting, and things can escalate very fast. And so I think that the way that I square all these ideas together is now things can be apocalyptic because conflict can be global, because we're all talking in the same global.
Yeah, and perhaps again, battling to the end is where we should look at here. This is his most pessimistic and final book. He battling to the end is Girard's attempt of completing a military theorist, one of the most famous, Clausewitz, in the 19th century, I believe. And Clausewitz's magnum opus on war began with, or so Girard claims, this apocalyptic insight that a politics or culture could no longer contain war. And he saw that Napoleon's total conscription, the ability to sort of turn an entire nation into a military apparatus, as the ability to do so. And so for Girard, he might agree that, there's peace right now, maybe in the last 30 years, but you're exactly right, David, that there is a potential energy there, not even just in the physical means that we have in the ability to destroy the world, i.e. nuclear weapons, but also in the inability of culture to stop war. I think what Girard has in mind is that, the Iliad ends with the sentence, and such was the burial of Hector, breaker of horses. And so there were these, and you can imagine how ridiculous that must be today if one of your generals dies, both sides agree to take like 12 days off to honor this guy. And there's and again, this goes back to the ambivalence of rationality. There's some part about the sort of modern psyche that is not able to do these ritual practices to stop, to halt the progress of war. It is also not able to completely stop war by doing sacrifice and pointing to a group and saying, they're the radical evil. Once we expel them, everything is going to be good. And so I think for Girard, this animosity between nations and between war is lingering and built up and not released even between wars. And he gives terrorism as a clear example. So
an example of the escalation to extremes, which is the phrase that is used over and over and over in that book. And one of the reasons why Girard believes there will be an escalation to extremes is that in the Christian revelation, the scapegoat mechanism was kind of revealed in its fullest form. So, the scapegoat mechanism prior to that was effective, right? In the sense that it was able to sort of bring some temporary form of peace. And Girard is saying that now that the scapegoat mechanism has been revealed, it's continuing to be revealed. It's, throughout the last 2,000 years, the scapegoat mechanism has sort of like lost its power to bring peace. So we just need more and more and more, and have to consume more and more victims. It seems like we find a different victim every day, and we no longer have the means of the scapegoat mechanism available to us. The way that societies, a few thousand years ago did. And what that means is like now the escalation, like what will prevent the escalation? So in Wanting, I talk about, is there going to be like a third innovation or a third invention? Whatever that means, because we've lost the scapegoat mechanism as a means to put an end to the violence, through violence, of course, right? This doesn't mean that it's good. It means that it was like a social technology that humans use to contain violence.
And I think probably the best example to what Luke is saying here, the one that Girard uses in Violence and the Sacred, is the story of Oedipus, right? Once Oedipus sort of accepts the throne, and there is a plague, I believe, that ravishes Thebes. There's a prophecy that it's because there's an ancestral a guy who killed his dad, and then he's out there trying to find who it is. Of course, it's him. And once it is expelled, there is a form of peace that actually does fall onto Thebes. And to Luke's point, and this is another deep point of ambivalence, in some sense, that's radically evil, because you're blaming this probably innocent victim whose incest has nothing to do with the sort of chaos at all. But on the other, there's a radical worldly form of goodness there, because you just need to sacrifice one person and the whole city comes back to life. Now imagine today with our coronavirus, how ridiculous it would be if we said, what the coronavirus, how it's caused? It's because Donald Trump had sex with his mom. And so once we put him in Guantanamo Bay, the plague would be, the coronavirus would go away. I mean, that was the sort of argument that at least, if Sophocles is to be believed, would have some merit.
To dive into that example, how much of this is I would say people wouldn't believe that as much because of some kind of scientific way of thinking as sort of the revelation of the scapegoat mechanism. But my question for both of you is, if you take the premise that the more people who know about the scapegoat mechanism, the less it then works, are then both of you doing a disservice to our ability to maintain a peaceful and orderly society by making Girard's ideas clear to the world?
I wrote a book that's going to bring about the apocalypse, man. That's what I was going for. What was I going to say? The coronavirus is a great example of this, right? I saw somebody on Twitter who was joking about, the solution to debt is to take all student loans and to pin it on one guy and just to kill him, right? Like, people see this. I don't know if the guy's ever read Girard, but it's funny. Like what he said is basically the scapegoat mechanism. One of the things that I think about a lot with the coronavirus is that, we can't, what will happen, right? Like the coronavirus, we can't like watch it die. We can't there's no like catharsis from just gradually eliminating the coronavirus. So I wonder, is there going to be a scapegoat for this? I think we've been trying to find some, but this is kind of a new situation that I think the world is in, where we don't have if this were Oedipus, we might have just blamed it on Donald Trump or something like that, and that worked back then. But it's not as effective today as it was then.
Yeah, and maybe directly to answer your question, David, about bringing apocalypse, or rather the charge of bringing about apocalypse. I believe. So the first thing I'll say is that, in some sense, in the Girardian worldview, the apocalypse is imminent. Not that the conditions are there already, but the Christian revelation and the exposure that it has and the knowledge that it contains is always going to grow. In fact, he has a line, I think it was book 1 of Things Hidden, where he says that the more it's persecuted, even the more that it will grow as well. Because the very act of persecution would be almost a proof of its truth. And so in one answer to your question is that, look, this thing's already out there. And furthermore, while it might be bringing worldly evil, if one is a Christian, which I'm not, but Luke is, it is spreading the word of God in some sense. And so again, it's that radical ambivalence. The other thing that I think is quite relevant to this, although it won't be satisfying to our listeners, is that Girard, in Battling to the End, basically walked back on 2 of his really important statements. One is that he walked back on the statement that Christianity is not a sacrificial religion. Maybe we can talk about that. But what's more relevant is that he walked back against a second statement, where he said that the mere knowledge of the scapegoat mechanism is enough to sort of pull people out of it. And I think perhaps this was out of youthful naivete, that in his earlier meaning like 50 and before, I felt like, and even in Things Hidden, he felt like he was doing a great service by simply revealing this mechanism. However, in Battling to the End, and again, this is where his late pessimism comes in, it was clear to him that it was going to take a lot more than just reason for people to escape this.
Yeah, and I think that's where he's very sort of different than Pinker. He said in somewhere, it might be Battling to the End. Actually, I'm sure it's Battling to the End. He said that the world is not a rational one; it's a religious one, right? So just like the enlightenment and knowledge of the scapegoat mechanism is not going to prevent me from turning somebody into a scapegoat or participating in that process. Like, it can happen, and there's a certain level of. And one of the reasons we're doing this is we want to bring in how does Buddhist thought, right, help us connect the dots and complete Girard. And that's why I think Jonathan's book project is really important. So there seems to be a really important role for humility, sort of knowledge without virtue, or knowledge without humility, or emptiness is something that you talk about in your book project, Jonathan. I'm curious as to what's the relationship between knowledge and rationality. And I think it can actually be very dangerous when it's not accompanied by let's call it some of the spiritual development that needs to happen for humanity.
So, Luke, I think that's a really interesting question about what is necessary for what Girard called conversion, right? And I think you'd agree with me that this Girardian conversion, which is fundamentally a release from the most perverse forms of mimetic desire, is not necessarily a Christian conversion, even though that there might be a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram. So I think the quote that I have from Girard about the interplay between the intellectual process and what is needed for conversion is this. He says that no purely intellectual process and no experience of a purely philosophical nature can help overcome sort of that desire. And I believe this point was even more hammered home to him in Battling to the End. Now, this is where I feel like a lot of the Buddhist resources were interesting. And so maybe first I'll give a brief gloss of superficially how they're similar. In Things Hidden, Book 3, which is one of the main books about psychology, Girard tries to describe conversion. And it's interesting because he uses an Oriental tale that I believe come from Buddhist cultures. And he says that this time it is not a false but a genuine conversion. The hero triumphs in defeat. He triumphs because he's at the end of his resources. For the first time, he has to look his despair and his nothingness in the face. But this look, which he has dreaded, which is the death of pride, is his salvation. The conclusions of all the novels are reminiscent of an Oriental tale in which the hero is clinging by his fingertips to the edge of a cliff. Exhausted, the hero finally lets himself fall into the abyss. He expects to smash against the rocks below, but instead he is supported by the air. The law of gravity is annulled. And there's another obviously very superficial similarity between Buddhism and Girard, and that's their problematization of desire, right? And not just the problematization of a specific desire, but almost all desire, at least prima facie, right? And so here's the conclusion that I came to, where I felt like Girardian social theory was the social side of Buddhist phenomenology, and Buddhist phenomenology delved deeper into this Girardian notion of pride, which he considers, and like many great theologians before him, like Augustine, he considers the root of all sin. So again, to put it very simply, I think the connection is this. Buddhist phenomenology identifies the root of our suffering in terms of three kleshas. There is aversion, there is sort of craving, and then there is misknowledge. And misknowledge is the core of the three aversions. And what we are misknowing, if we may, is the nature of phenomena. And again, to put it very simply, the Buddhists think that we believe that things exist intrinsically and that they're self-standing. And maybe one good example I can give you is, these AirPods. We know that there's like atoms flying in and out of it every time I move it, yet we can still consider this one entity that goes through time. Now, one may wonder, well, why is this the root of suffering? At least according to one strand of interpretation, it's the root of our suffering because once we apply those same ontological status of phenomenon to ourselves, i.e. we want ourselves to be all-lasting, to be self-standing, that is where we need objects to pursue, to both averse and say, this is not me, and to crave, saying this object identifies me. And suddenly, I imagine you can see how we're getting close to the Girardian triangle of a mimetic rivalry. And in fact, my claim is that this Buddhist triangle of misknowledge, craving, and aversion is simply the phenomenological side of the Girardian triangle, which is a social triangle that has mediation that is linked to misknowledge, because it's fundamentally based on pride and a desire to be metaphysically autonomous, or as you described it, self-sufficient. And then the positive phase of mediation is related to craving, to finding a model and desiring what the model desires. And there's also a negative phase, right, of rivalry, where I desire things exactly what the rival does not have or is not. And that relates to aversion. And so maybe to sum it all up, because I've been talking too long already, the Buddhists I think, tackle the fundamental phenomenological problem that Girard does not put enough effort to resolve. And they also provide meditative sort of practices to correct our phenomenological error. Now, one more point here is that I don't think we necessarily need to go into sort of the Orient to find a satisfying solution to Girard. We might also look at a thinker like Hegel. And the critique for Girard, and this is my biggest critique of Girard, is that he does not spend enough time interrogating this notion of being, of which desire is aimed at. And the way that he takes being is that being has to be this grandiose, I want to be like God, je suis l'état, a type of grandiosity. And I think even if he looked at Hegel's phenomenology, for example, where being takes a journey and evolves, he would find many resources to correct our desire.
So in the thank you for that, Johnathan. So in the Buddhist phenomenology, would a desire for being be something to rid oneself of as part of the process of conversion?
Yeah. So the desire for this specific type of being that is described would indeed be, right, to think of oneself as intrinsically existent. And again, that ontological status has very practical aims. If I want to think of myself as living forever, maybe I have to build empires to sort of prove that. And if I want to think of myself as, independent of causes, maybe I need slaves or servants around me such that my desires are the primary ones that dictates the world around me. So indeed, that mode of phenomenology, mode of being, is to be rid of. But it's not to say nothing exists whatsoever. And again, this gets very complicated, just the mode of the existence changes. It becomes what is called emptiness, or on the positive side, dependent origination. And basically, it's to recognize the intradividual, as Girard says. It's the pursuit of mode of being that is inherently connected. And the classic, there's a Buddhist, I don't know if metaphor is the right word here, called the net of Indra, and it's this sort of metaphor that is able to aims to describe how the Buddhist ontology and worldview is based, and it's this infinite series of mirrors that all reflect off of each other. That's the net of Indra. And I think that is also the ontology that we're supposed to shift to in some sense. This sort of interconnectedness that is both called emptiness as well as dependent origination.
Interesting. So, I'm going to respond with, there's so many similarities between this way of thinking that I can connect to the kind of the Christian vision of it. What's fascinating, and this, I'm so excited to have this conversation. My book and your book project have similar structures in that the first half sort of attempt to present mimetic theory and Girard's thought in our own words and faithful to the thinking itself. And then in the second part, we're both trying in our own ways to complete it, right? And to make sense, like, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the world? I take a Christian perspective and you take a Buddhist one. And I think we can sort of start to bring them together. That's what's really cool about this. I'm fast. I have to ask you, because I think that we're saying a lot of the same things. Why did you choose to use Dante as the main image, right, throughout your website? Talking about Girard and Buddhism, you use this sort of great Christian poet, because Dante for me is like the symbol of this transformation of desire, that reordering of desire that has to happen. So what's the connection with Dante?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not surprised at all that you find a lot of similarities to the prescriptions that you provide, if not because, by hopefully pursuing this fundamental link, by connecting Christian pride. One of my favorite passages in The City of God by Augustine is this exegesis he does on this one line about pride, but which I won't go into. But my ambitions for this project, and it's uncompleted, ironically, it's still a manuscript in the work, is to connect this Christian notion of pride with this Buddhist notion of intrinsic existence. And because these two central concepts are the core of their respective metaphysics, as well as ethical theory, I'm not surprised at all that the other parts that flow out of this you find so much similarity with. For example, compassion and Christian love. But to answer your question directly, I used Dante. Well, the only part where I explicitly mentioned Dante in the manuscript is, I believe, in the beginning, where I described Girard as my Dante. I had this hopefully quite, or I think quite clever line, where I said something like, I began this book project when I was 20, in the midway of our journey in college, for I found myself in a dark place in life. I had lost the path that does not stray, which is obviously the beginning to the Inferno, and so Girard really rescued me from, not to connotate something more extreme than I intend, like pathologies, that I was extremely prideful, not that I'm not now, and extremely not humble, and just directed by metaphysical and the mimetic desire in a very perverse way that was existentially insufferable to myself. And so Girard helped me avoid the most extreme manifestations of those sort of mimetic pathologies. He also helped me purge their more subtle forms. However, just like Virgil led Dante, and my analysis was that sort of Girard was my Virgil. He was not, obviously, in Paradise, the sort of last part of Dante's trilogy. Virgil has to leave Dante, right? Virgil still belongs to limbo, and he can't lead Dante to a final salvation. And so that there's also an implicit critique there that Girard, and I'm sure this is why part of the reason why you wrote your book as well, is just not satisfying in his normative prescriptions at all, right? And in one interview, they asked him, like, what do we do? And Girard is like, what do you mean? And that's not the project I'm trying to pursue here. And in fact, he said that it's up to people, it's up to sort of other people to sort of analyze this work and figure out what to do. And so, I'm sorry, this is a really long-winded way to answer your question, but I used the imagery of Dante, specifically Virgil, because in some sense, Virgil is like Girard is like my Virgil, where he's able to perfectly expose the nature of evil. But I just feel like he's very lacking in helping me try to get to the final salvation.
I felt the same way. And everybody wants prescriptions, but I kind of feel like Girard, right? Like he just kind of like leaned back in his chair and took a big drag on his cigarette and is like, it's up to you guys to figure out, right? To work out your own salvation, kind of. I actually thought about incorporating Dante into Wanting, and I was like, this would get way too complicated. So I'm just going to leave that out of there. But I love how you use the imagery, right? The images say a lot. So one way that I think this can be understood from a Christian perspective is this kind of desire for being works itself out in a relationship, in a relational context, right? In a relationship with the one who is the fullness of being, as opposed to trying to make ourselves into gods, as like Harari says at the end of Sapiens and Homo Deus, like humanity is trying to upgrade themselves into gods. So it's that humility, right? Understanding that we're relational and that we don't possess like metaphysical autonomy and independence. We subsist in Christian theology, in God. And we only sort of, as Augustine said, right, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So it's that search for a relationship, not knowledge, a relationship, which gives the knowledge. So those two things are related, right? Like love and knowledge are highly related things. There really can't be perfect knowledge of another without love for the other, and vice versa. So the reason why I think Dante was such a beautiful image to use in your work and why he resonates with me is like that embodies what I believe is kind of the way out. It's the journey that Dante took. At the beginning of the Inferno, those three beasts, the she-wolf and the other two, I forget what they were exactly, a leopard or something. Those represent disordered desires. And then the process, the journey that he went on was not one of ridding himself of desires. He rid himself of the sinful desires, the rivalrous desires, the pride, and reordered everything towards ultimately love, right? So where you get to the end of the book, it's actually the end quote in Wanting is straight from Dante. And it's like, by now, I see the desire and the love that has moved the sun and the stars. So it's the process of reordering desires, not ridding himself of desire. And in fact, Girard was not the model for me either. Girard got me started, but he doesn't serve as the kind of like sort of supreme for a Christian, of course, is Christ, right? But because we're humans and we rely on sort of incarnate models are always more powerful to us. I think the saints, right? So like the journey that I sort of, the way that I think the people in the world that I think from a Christian perspective that have exemplified the way out is the journey of a saint, basically. Saintly model. And I think you sort of had hinted at that near the end of your book too. You said you weren't quite satisfied with thinking of Girard as just this pacifist, like you just have to disengage with the world. And you said, maybe there is like a better model for this. And I think you even used the word, like maybe it's some form of saintliness. And I think that that's right. From what I understand, Girard, some people have even described Girard as having a certain amount of holiness, right? I think he was a very virtuous person. But with lacking those positive models, and Girard says like positive models and shared models are becoming invisible in the modern world. Like it's really hard to find them anymore. And I think that creates a situation where everybody's just an internal mediator to everybody else. Girard says like the modern world is the world of internal mediation, right? Like lacking a transcendent model. And I sort of hint at and wanting like that's creating a relatively dangerous condition.
Yeah. So Luke, I have a lot of questions to ask about your work and a lot of points to learn from, especially on the part 2, the prescription side. But I'll just make one comment first about this fundamental connection that I think you drew, which I think is the right one between the Buddhism, at least the one that I've presented, as well as the Christian thought, and not just Girard, although obviously Girard specifically. And it's this notion of pride, right? I believe in Desire and Deceit, the novel, Girard identifies the fundamental reason that we have metaphysical desire for being is pride. And maybe pride is something we've always had, but it's been inflamed in modernity when, quote unquote, God has died and we have killed him, right? That we think that this is something that humans should be able to have. And what always struck me, and this is the piece of Christian theology that I've been most influenced by, I think it was book 15 of City of God in Augustine, where he does this exegesis on this one line. I think it's, thou casteth them down when they raise themselves up. And Augustine's point here is that the sentence is structured in a very interesting way. It's not that, obviously, though here is God, it's not that people rise themselves up. It's not the Greek view, right, where the gods pile pride upon the ones whom they wish to see fall. The gods do not actively sort of put you down because they're jealous, in the Christian God at least. However, what's interesting is that in the Christian worldview, so in the Greek worldview, it's that you get more and more prideful, you get too close to Zeus, he zaps you with his lightning bolt, right? In the Christian worldview, and this is where Augustine's point is, that word when is very important, is that it's simultaneous. The very raising of oneself is the debasing of oneself because it closes oneself off to God. Now, as a secular, to interpret it secularly, we can say we close ourselves off to others, and that's still debasement, right? And so Augustine concludes that fundamentally there's something in humility that exalts and in pride that debases. And that's something that has just tremendously influenced me. But Luke, I would love to hear you in your own words describe your recommendations in part 2, especially this reordering of desires. I find it extremely fascinating. And so I'm just curious, I shared a bit about my incomplete thoughts in the manuscript and what to do here. But I'm curious, what is the prescription that you have for people who are trapped in this mimetic swamp?
I honestly don't. So I share some things in the book that I've tried to work out in my own life, and I hesitate to call them prescriptions at all for other people, right? Because there's a wide variety of people that are grappling with these things. Not all of them are Christians. that's why I love having a conversation like this. It's like, what's the common ground? So I used intentionally ambiguous language, so that people could connect it to their own lives and where they're at. I think that Girard's, like, conversion is a word that we keep coming back to in this conversation, and it's a really important word in Girard. I mean, in fact, he saw in what he called the novelistic conversion, after he had finished basically writing Deceit, Desire, and the novel, he rewrote it. Definitely the last chapter it's very different than the rest of the book, and he saw the conversion of the novelist, which one doesn't need to be religious to see that there is some type of conversion taking place. And I don't know why, like, this should be obvious, right? Like, I don't understand why conversion only has to be spoken of in religious or Christian theology. Like, there clearly is such a thing as a secular conversion, an intellectual conversion, and most importantly, like a conversion between just like somebody who's prideful and just kind of like a bad person to somebody who becomes, a more loving husband, father, and human being, somebody who's empathy. I mean, that's clearly a process of conversion. And different religious traditions just explain what's going on in different ways. So clearly, Girard saw what happened to the novelist in Deceit and Desire in the novel as, what's the word I'm looking for? As like a mirror to a spiritual conversion that he was undergoing himself at that very time. So I think that one of the goals, I mean, the problem with a prescription is this: nobody can just read a book and have a conversion, or be prescribed like a 5-step program to salvation or something like that, right? This is like a form of Gnosticism, which I'm totally trying to avoid. It's why I can't stand, like, every podcast that I go on, quite frankly, is like, well, what do we do? What are the 3 to 5 steps? And it's like, it doesn't work like that, because what this is actually about at the end of the day is about some process of conversion. And often for people in their life, that comes from hitting rock bottom. It comes from just like experiencing their own sort of creatureliness and sort of like weakness and emptiness, and realizing the folly that was driving them, largely due to pride. And this is exactly what Girard recognized in the great novelist. Like, they came face to face with their own pride, and in a certain sense, they saw how, like, silly and vain and ridiculous this project, like, that they had worked up in their minds was. So, I think there are certain things that there are like preambles to a type of conversion that I think we can talk about in somewhat of a prescriptive way, almost like preconditions, or like an openness to change. And some of the things I talk about in the book, you and I actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, were both introduced to Girard in the context of a retreat. So for me, this was a silent retreat in the hills of Rome, where the retreat director, unbeknownst to me, was a Girardian, and he made me read the 8th chapter of John over and over and over and over again, the woman caught in adultery, until I finally started to see some of the mimetic stuff that was happening in it. So that's one prescription that I give in the book, is basically just like, we need to, in a certain sense, and let's stop after this, right? Because we could just keep going, because you talk about something very similar. There does, at some level, have to be a disengagement, some space created in order to re-engage. And I think that's really, really important in order to be able to step back and get some perspective and be able to examine ourselves. And you described sort of at the end of your book project, like, hey, I'm not done yet, but I'm ready to sort of like, I'm gonna go forward. And there's an iterative process right now. We probably bring Hegel into this. I don't know if it's a dialectical process or not, but there is this process of contemplation and action, and one sort of informs the other. And that's a really, really important concept to understand. This is true in Buddhist thought and in Christian thought, the relationship between action and contemplation.
This idea of the shortcomings of prescriptions is something that I've been trying to grapple with, because I think that 2 things are true, and I'm trying to square how they can both be true at the same time. And the first is that a teacher or a writer cannot just tell you how to live your life. They cannot put words on a page, then you take those words, do exactly what they tell you to do, and there will be answers. But also, all of us have had teachers in our lives who have pushed us in a direction that has allowed us to discover things, right? Right here, it's Girard, right? All three of us have read Girard, been moved by his work, then interpreted it in our own ways. And the two of you basically said, okay, now we need to complete this. And I think that with these really difficult, deep ideas, they can only be accessed through metaphor. And the metaphor that I use to work through this is the map and the territory. What a teacher can do is they can give you a really good map, high resolution. They can allow you to zoom in and out like Google Maps. But we all have looked at a map of a city that we're going to and then actually gotten on the ground and had that map be exactly the same as what we saw, but also entirely different. And once we went into the map, we saw the world through effort and through walking with footsteps, through actually touching the contours of cobblestone. We then begin to see the complexity of the world. And you can only discover the territory for yourself. But what a good prescription does is it gives you a good map that then you can use to navigate that territory.
I couldn't agree with that more. And the reason I love that metaphor so much is because you're both highlighting the limitations of the map, right? Even the best map possible is not a substitute for experience, in your case, the territory. But you're also highlighting the power of the map. There are really bad maps, right? Like I remember those Apple maps that those Japanese people followed and drove into the sea or something. But I think this ties back to Luke's point as well, where Girard, even after going through his intellectual conversion, right, changing the last chapter of Desire, Deceit, into the novel, it took him being close to death, sort of having cancer. I think it was like a year or two after, like immediately after, for him to actually have a radical change. And so, David, in the analogy of your metaphor, the map there might have been the Dostoevskys of the world and all those authors that Girard had read. And however, the territory was a necessity for Girard to go through. And so, the thinker I'd like to bring into all of these things is Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, obviously another Christian theologian, had a strong distaste for the Enlightenment's hubris in what it thought reason could do. And Kierkegaard, I think it was in Scientific Postscript, talked about the necessity of subjective truth. For example, love. And that and his claim was that there were certain things that each generation must learn by themselves, i.e., the pain of losing in love, the brilliance of love in its highest, in its best moments. And so I think maybe to put this in Kierkegaardian terms, that there is a form of objective knowledge that can be communicated to reason that helps us make sense of our subjective experience. But at the end of the day, I think both are necessitated and required to produce this conversion, which is why that I feel like Girard was so pessimistic at the end, because it does require a lot of, Luke, as you say, preconditions.
Yeah, this reminds me of truth can be objective, but it's like beauty, but it's experienced subjectively, and there needs to be some kind of like sort of coming together or co-naturality, or else things remain abstract and unreal. John Henry Newman used this phrase, unreal words, as he was describing the way that a lot of Christians like throw out language like heaven and hell and grace. And like most people have no existential contact with what these words mean. There's no co-naturality there. And that's the challenge, I think, with Girard too. Like we have these discussions and he provides like a map, but you have to go there. Like you have to actually like go to the city and start walking around, keeping these things in mind. And that's where I think the map is really important. And then you sort of come up against things, you come up against structures. The way that, one thing that I think that here's a limitation of prescriptions is that I think there are some prescriptions that apply to all people just because we're human and we share a human nature. But our journeys are so different, right? Depending on the culture we grew up in, part of the world we're in. So that's why people need to grapple with this stuff and work through it. and share their experiences. But I think David's metaphor of the map was spot on, and we're kind of constructing a map, because Girard didn't complete the map, and we're all trying to, we're both filling in the map and going around in the city at the same time, and that's a really cool thing.
Yeah, and I think, again, to tie back to Christianity, one connection that I made in your last discussion, Luke, is actually between Luther and what we're talking about now, where Luther had the three onlys, right? It's through I think it's through grace only are we saved, through faith only can we be open to grace, and through reading scripture only can we be open to faith. Or no, I'm sorry, I think it's faith, grace, and then scripture. And I think that's another great example of map as well, right? It's only by reading scripture and putting in the time can you be even open to the grace of God and open to these subjective experiences. However, that is a necessary but not sufficient condition. One may very well read as much scripture as they want, but not be blessed by the grace of one of these experiences that converts them in a radical way. And Luke, maybe this is a good time for you to share a few more of your maps, if you will, on the prescriptive side. You talked about
on anti-mimetic, because Luke, your Substack is called Anti-mimetic. I think that's one that all three of us can orbit around well. And the place that I want to begin here is, do we need to be anti-mimetic in that we can only look towards God and imitate God? Thing one. Thing two is, do we need to be anti-mimetic towards people in our lives, but we can have external mediators such as social media influencers who are sort of outside our sphere? Or three, and in my reading of Girard, this is impossible, but I want to pose it as a potential solution. Do we need to try to escape external desire and find our own desires from within?
I think in Girardian terms, the third is impossible, right? And the paradox is that, when I use the word anti-mimetic, I don't mean freeing ourselves from mimesis. I'm speaking of destructive mimesis, right? So those were three different things. Why don't we just tackle them? So the first one, you might have to remind me, but in terms of relationships, being anti-mimetic in relationships, one way to be anti-mimetic is, let's talk about like a loving relationship. Non-rivalrous love is anti-mimetic in the sense, in the best possible sense, in that it's not, people that are in relationships can be in mimetic relationships all the time. Like Ergulian talks about this in some of his books, right? He diagnoses like couples, even husband and wife, that are mimetic with each other. So developing some anti-mimetic aspects to that relationship where you're not like actually competing with each other for power and status and respect and all of those things. That's one way to be anti-mimetic. But at the same time, like for every anti-mimetic prescription, there's probably one where we need to be more mimetic in positive ways. Like love itself is mimetic. Empathy can be mimetic. The paradox with all of this is, like Girard would say, like if you take this long enough, like doesn't all mimetic desire like turn negative eventually? That's kind of the question that I'd love to know what the Buddhist perspective on that is. That's kind of the paradox and the challenge here. Like we can be anti-mimetic in thwarting kind of destructive rivalry, but it's kind of a constant. It's not like it's something that we develop once and for all, because all sort of desire can turn mimetic given enough time. That's my reading of Girard, Johnathan. I don't know if you read him the same way. And it's only sort of in finding the right model, which in the Christian perspective is Christ, is the only model that you can follow completely, is the only model that's completely sort of worthy of following, where that kind of imitation can never become rivalrous.
Luke, what do you think about the nature of inspiration here? So say that I look at one of your books, for example, and I'm inspired. And so there's something mimetic about inspiration, but there's also something that is positive, some that is inventive about inspiration. Where does that fit into this picture?
Inspiration. So you're talking about being inspired in a positive way by somebody.
Exactly, right? Because I think that in the nature of being inspired is mimetic, because you're saying, I want to be more like that. And I feel called to model them. But at least in its initial stages, I think it's positive. But I also love what you just said, that given enough time, all desire can turn mimetic.
So here's the really important thing about that. So if there's a positive model of desire, somebody that inspires us, we want to be more like that. Girard says in several different places, like the best models are the models that that sort of lower themselves and don't sort of like ask to be that don't become what's the how does he put it? Johnathan, you might actually know where he says this. I'm pretty sure it's in Evolution and Conversion. I might have to look it up because it's really important. There are certain kinds of models that inspire imitation, but then give space to the person imitating to sort of like become who they are without becoming an obstacle and a scandal to them. Does that make sense? So like Maria Montessori is the example of this that I give in the book. Like the teacher can model a desire for something good and then withdraw as a mediator so that the teacher does not become a perpetual obstacle. So the best models to imitate are the kinds of models that don't become rivals, basically. And we live in a world where everybody's saying like imitate me, but like not too much, because if you get a little bit too close and you imitate me too closely, whether you're a podcast host or whatever, then that becomes dangerous. And there's very few people that have that kind of non-rivalrous disposition.
I would agree with what all Luke has said. And the first thing I'll say is that Girard is, in a very unsatisfying way, dead silent about most of these issues that you're asking us, David. Girard talks about conversion a little bit in the Desire, Deceit in the novel, in the piece that Luke just mentioned. But other than that, it's mostly just doom and gloom for him. Even though when pressed in certain interviews, he says that fundamentally, mimetic desire, even the bad ones this is where his ambivalence comes back in, are good in some sense, because it's about relating to the other. And so maybe if we should take a step back here and try to understand what mimesis is trying to capture. And what I always found helpful was the notion of that Hume brought up on human nature. Now, obviously, a very important notion for Hume that almost increasing importance in his predecessor, Adam Smith, is the notion of sympathy. And Hume had a really great metaphor that I think is just as relevant for mimesis. And it's the co-vibration of violin strings. If you have two strings together and you were to flick one, the other would have a sort of co-vibration. And that is what Hume used as a metaphor for sympathy. And I think that is just as warranted a metaphor as mimesis. It's a form of co-experience. And once defined in that way, you can see that mimesis, and Girard does say it, even if it's not prominent in his works, is the basis for compassion. Right? It's the ability to see someone, to experience what they're feeling, and then to act as if it were your own. It would be to having a we inside the I, to use Hegelian language. And so clearly, mimesis is such a fundamental capacity of humanity that there's no escape from it. Right? In fact, the arc of humanization, the transformation of animal to man for Girard is marked by the ability of increased acquisitive mimesis, right? So Girard takes this as such a fundamental capacity that to be anti-mimetic in the very naive way, which Luke already dismissed, is almost impossible, and even if it were, certainly not desirable. And this is maybe where the Buddhism part comes in, but it should be accessible to everyone. My stance on this is that because mimesis is going to penetrate almost all of our desires, and so all of our impetuses of action, I think the real, like, if you want a clear cut between like good, bad, is between whether pride is motivating them. I draw this distinction where this is only on one part of Girard, he makes a distinction between quote unquote physical desire, and that's the desire for the object and the experience, and then metaphysical desire, the desire to be. And while I don't think, and we discussed this a bit already, that all desire to be is perverse, that there are many perverse manifestations of desire to be. And so maybe, David, to answer all of your questions simply, I think insofar as you're truthful to yourself and you know that what you desire is not pride or being or to about what the object says about you, I think that's the simplest cut of what is safe and unsafe. And maybe as an example, even to Luke's point, it is unsafe to even desire someone who debases themselves if what you're doing it is out of a fundamental, how should we put this? A fundamental notion of who you self are, if that makes sense. And Nietzsche's criticism of resentment comes in here, right? And we can all think about the person who sort of debases themselves, but clearly in a passive aggressive way. And so I think that if I were to make one split between what type of mimetic desire is safe or unsafe, obviously there's a lot more nuances, it would be whether that mimetic desire is motivated by what the object says about you or by whether you really desire to have the object. And David, in your question, if I'm inspired to be like Elon because I see all the recognition that he's getting, because I think he's, greater than man, so to speak, and I desire to be like him, then I think that will be perverse. And in fact, the in the moment experience of entrepreneurship may be so uninteresting to you that it becomes a very hollowed life that you live. However, if you're inspired by Elon because you love working on problems, you love the experience of working with others and building these things and seeing them through and working long hours, then I feel like that could be much more kosher.
Yeah, so pride, and I would just put envy right up there with pride. Slightly different things, but Girard says that envy might be like the most predominant form or manifestation of mimetic desire in the world. But I would agree with you. Like, what is motivating the mimetic desire? One other really important point to make, and I'm not sure how much pride comes into this, but it's so mimesis, mimetic desire, is fundamental openness to other people. It allows us to enter into their experience, kind of the ground of empathy and sympathy. Like without mimesis, it wouldn't really be possible. The important point is, I think one important way to be anti-mimetic and why we need more anti-mimetic people in the best sense of the word, is it prevents the kind of mob formation. When people realize that they are getting caught up in a mimetic process, they lose self-possession. They lose all agency. And just seeing when that is starting to happen, to be able to enter into a conversation with somebody that you totally fundamentally disagree with on a political point, on a worldview, to be able to enter into a conversation with them and an experience with them and say, listen, it's okay for me to be able to enter fully into your experience and understand it without necessarily agreeing with it, is a really important, I think, thing for everybody to develop. It's not something we're necessarily born with. And it's the only way that's going to prevent the herd mentality and the formation of kind of mob mentality that leads to scapegoats, is if people develop the ability to be anti-mimetic when they sense that they're sort of within the pull, which is a very powerful pull of the destructive mimetic desire. And that's not easy. But I think when you're aware of it, you can at least, and I find myself, sensing that, you can at least start to feel like a little pull and become aware of it and then do what you need to do to step back.
One of the things that, as we begin to wrap, that I feel like is a theme in this conversation for all three of us, Girard has exerted this positive influence. And I'm wondering if Girard has such a positive influence at the individual, we can have some agency, but then because of the awareness of the scapegoat, there's sort of this big picture apocalyptic second order effects that sort of the exposure, the transparency of the scapegoat mechanism has created. And I'm wondering, maybe he is good for the individual, bad for society. But Johnathan, you also kind of shook your head when I said that Girard has been good for us. I don't know if that's because he's driven you insane writing this book, or
I was being facetious. But no, finish your question, David. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I'm really just making a conjecture here that what if Girard is good for the individual, bad for the world?
Yeah, well, I was actually going to respond to Luke's point. I've been talking so much that I withheld, but since you asked the question, I'll go there. This sort of the positive side of what Luke is describing of this mob sort of mentality is a form of union with a larger whole, right? It's kind of this sort of like solidarity, and in fact, in Violence and the Sacred, obviously there's going to be negative connotations because it has to do with pagan religions. Girard basically said, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that mythology or the sacred is nothing but unanimity. And this is why this sort of lack of reason and the proliferation of the mob is important for the sacrificial mechanism. It's what enables and I think that's a good question also, to go back into earlier conversation. What enables everyone in Thebes to believe that this one patricidal, incestual guy caused the entire plague? What is it? It's not reason, it's unanimity. It's simply because everyone else in Thebes believes that it happened. And so, again, that might be a negative example. Maybe a positive example would be cheering on for a sports team. But even in what we just described, and clearly there are instances where Luke is right, that it would be good to stand up against the mob. But there is a form of morphing with a larger group, with the mob, that is, at the very least, a very enjoyable human experience to be a part of. And again, this is where Girard's ambivalence comes from. And I don't think we can make any sweeping conjectures. I think if we're given a specific environment, maybe like the Nazis or the French resistance or in a sports team, we have more to say about what one ought to do. But even then, if you read Girard too much, you're going to see.
Yeah. So I'm obviously using mob in the negative sense. As you're saying that, I'm reminded of Tony Hsieh in his book Delivering Happiness, right, where he looked at raves as this like beautiful union with other people, and it is like we seek that, right? It's a form of transcendence that every human being seeks, and he found a transcendent experience in a rave. There's something like we do want to be in union with other people. It's something that every person craves. Girard used a very interesting term to just sort of describe the scapegoat mechanism, and he says it's deviated transcendence. So when sometimes people find transcendence in the wrong ways, like it's kind of like right desire, right? Transcendence, like we all sort of seek that. But when it's found in the mob, he calls that deviated transcendence, and that every scapegoat mechanism are humans like finding a negative form of transcendence and unifies them. So there is, to your point, there's this deep ambivalence about it, right? So it's not that it's bad in itself; it's that the way that we often find it can result in negative consequences and violence to other people. So that term kept coming back to me, and this goes all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about equality and sameness and differentiation. So we're almost coming full circle when we talk about mobs and the need for union with other people. It's a double-edged sword.
That's a great place to close. Good conversation, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.